January 6, 1943. Paris, France. The muffled click of boots on the cobblestones echoed softly in the gray, fog-filled morning. Claire's footsteps were precise, deliberate. She adjusted the strap of the Red Cross uniform across her shoulder, the weight of the medical supplies barely noticeable to her now. The city was under occupation, a constant hum of fear pulsing through its veins. In the distance, the sharp silhouette of a German patrol truck loomed, a reminder of the ever-present danger lurking in every corner. She had made this journey countless times before, across the city, through its twisting streets and alleys, past the grand buildings that had once been a symbol of freedom, now overshadowed by the looming occupation. The uniform was a shield. In the midst of wartime Paris, it provided an illusion of neutrality. It was a cloak that allowed her to move unseen, unnoticed, trusted. The Red Cross was a symbol of compassion, of help for the wounded, the weary. It was expected that those who wore it would be immune to suspicion. But that was only part of the story. Beneath the bright red cross on her chest, Claire carried much more than just soup for the soldiers. Hidden in the folds of her uniform were meticulously folded maps, documents that could save lives or send them to their graves. She had been doing this for months now, carrying information, plans, coordinates. She was part of a network, a fragile thread that tied together the scattered resistance forces across the city and the countryside. These maps, once hidden in the folds of her coat, now became her most precious cargo. She paused at the corner of Rue de Rivoli, just outside a cafe. Her heart raced, not from exertion, but from the pressure of the moment. The soldiers at the checkpoint were routine, almost indifferent. But all it would take was one wrong glance, one misplaced movement, and her life would be forfeit. She adjusted her cap, trying to maintain her composure as she walked past them. The soldiers gave her a cursory look, then went back to their patrols, uninterested. She had become invisible. But it wasn't just the Germans she had to worry about. The real threat lay in the shadowy figures who watched from within. The collaborators who sought to betray their own for the sake of a false sense of safety. The French police, now complicit in the occupation, who would turn over anyone who dared defy the Reich. There were spies everywhere, even among those she thought she could trust. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she turned a corner, reaching a narrow alleyway where a contact awaited. His name was Pierre, a young man in his 20s who had become an invaluable link in the chain of communication. His family's grocery store had been turned into a front for resistance operations. The store's back door opened into a network of safe houses, tunnels, and hidden rooms. It was a lifeline for fighters on the run, for those who needed to escape the clutches of the occupying force. Claire was not the only one who walked these streets, carrying her role in secret. But she was one of the few who dared to wear the mask of neutrality so effortlessly. She stepped into the store, a bell chiming above the door as she entered. Inside, the smell of fresh bread and cured meats filled the air, a stark contrast to the war-torn world outside. Pierre was waiting, his face tense. He didn't greet her. Instead, he gestured subtly to the back room. Claire followed him, her pace steady despite the surge of adrenaline that threatened to crack her composure. In the back room, she unstrapped the canvas bag from her shoulder. It was deceptively light, but inside, it held the kind of secrets that could bring entire operations to their knees. "How many today?" she asked, her voice steady, almost casual. "3," Pierre replied, his voice low. "The main group is holding out, but they'll need more time. And the Germans are tightening their grip. We need more eyes, more safe houses." She nodded, already knowing the task ahead. This was the quiet work of resistance. Not grand speeches or heroic gestures, but small, silent movements. Hands slipping maps into pockets, smiles exchanged at the right moment, false assurances given where they were needed most. The cost was never visible at first, but it was always there, hidden in the spaces between words, in the eyes that lingered too long. Claire reached into the bag, pulling out the maps with care. Each one was carefully drawn, each one a lifeline for someone desperate enough to take it. They detailed safe houses, secret routes, the locations of German patrols. The information was coded, designed to evade detection should the wrong person come across it. But even so, the risk was monumental. One wrong step, one careless word, and everything would unravel. "Give these to the others," she said, handing over the maps. "There are more coming in tomorrow. Keep your heads down." Pierre's hand shook slightly as he took the bundle. His eyes flickered to the door, a nervous glance, as if checking for any unseen threats. "I'll do what I can," he said, his voice thick with gratitude and fear. Claire nodded. "Do it quickly. We can't afford delays." She turned to leave, but something in Pierre's eyes stopped her. "Claire," he said, hesitating for a moment, Are we making a difference?" The question was simple, but in it lay the weight of everything she had endured. They had been fighting for so long, for so little, and the end was always just out of reach. Claire didn't have an answer. Instead, she gave him a small smile, one that she hoped conveyed everything her words could not. She left the store and continued down the street, the sounds of the city moving around her like a dream. But even as she moved through the occupied streets, a strange sense of isolation settled in her chest. The world seemed divided between those who could see the war and those who could not. The soldiers who marched through Paris saw it as a conquest. The collaborators saw it as an opportunity. But Claire saw it for what it was, a desperate struggle for survival, for hope, for something that could not yet be named. The Red Cross uniform was a lie, a beautiful lie. And as long as she wore it, the world would never know the price of the truth she carried beneath it. March 14th, 1943. The French countryside. The wind howled through the small window, rattling the old wooden frame of the farmhouse as Claire stepped inside. The air was damp, and the faint smell of tobacco and wood smoke clung to the walls. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from a low-burning fire in the hearth. The flames flickered, casting long shadows across the floor, where a map of the region was spread out, its edges worn from constant handling. The room was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the house settling under the weight of time and war. The farmhouse was not a place for comfort. It was a safe house, one of many scattered across the countryside, a hidden network that had become the lifeblood of the French resistance. And tonight, it was where Claire would be handed the most dangerous mission of her life. She moved with practiced precision, taking in the layout of the room, the faces of those waiting. The tension was palpable. There was no room for mistakes here. Every decision had weight. Every move had consequences. She set down her bag and glanced at the man waiting by the table. Georges, a fellow resistance fighter and an old friend. His eyes were narrowed, focused, but there was a hint of concern in them. Concern that mirrored the way Claire felt deep in her bones. "You're late," Georges said, his voice low and steady, a quiet reproach hidden beneath the words. "I know," Claire replied, her voice just as quiet. She didn't need to explain the delays. The streets had grown more treacherous, the German presence tighter. It was becoming harder to move around undetected. But there was no time to dwell on it. "What's the situation?" Georges nodded toward the map. "We've got a transport ready to move. It's a small group, but they're important. They have intel on the German supply lines. They've been on the run for weeks. The only way to get them out is through the old quarry route. But there's a problem." Claire stepped closer to the map, her eyes scanning the marked points. The quarry route was one of the safest, but it was also the most vulnerable. It had been compromised before. If the Germans knew about it, if they were lying in wait. She shook her head, trying to push the doubt away. "How bad? We don't know yet. But there's a convoy heading that way, and we've lost contact with one of the safe houses. They should have checked in by now." Claire's pulse quickened. Losing contact was never a good sign. The route was risky enough without having to worry about someone betraying them, or worse, being captured. "Where do you need me?" she asked, already knowing the answer. She could see it in Georges' eyes. He wasn't going to make this decision alone. It would fall to her, as it always did. "You're going to lead the group out. You know the terrain better than anyone else here. If anyone can make it through, it's you." She felt the weight of his words settle over her. It was the kind of responsibility she had accepted long ago, but never got easier. Not when lives were at stake. Not when every step could lead to death. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a leader. She was just Claire, a woman who had learned to survive in a world turned upside down. But sometimes survival meant carrying the weight of others' fates on her shoulders. She glanced at the small group gathered in the room. They were the last hope for the resistance in this region. If it didn't get through, the entire network could collapse. Claire knew that, but she also knew the danger. The quarry route was dangerous, yes, but it was the only route that could get them through undetected. The alternative was to go back through Paris, where the risk of capture was far greater. "What's the plan?" Claire asked, already reaching for her bag to collect the necessary supplies. "Follow the usual route. Get to the quarry. We'll have a lookout set up. From there, the plan is to cross into the woods and make for the hills. The convoy will be waiting for you on the other side." Claire nodded. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. She turned to the others in the room. "Everyone ready?" A few nods, a few silent gestures of confirmation. Claire's eyes lingered on each face, wondering which one of them would never return, which one would fall along the way. But she didn't ask. There was no time. Georges handed her a small packet. "This," he said, "is for the leader of the convoy. Make sure it gets to him." She took the packet, tucking it safely into her coat. A part of her wanted to ask what it contained, but she knew better. It didn't matter. Not now. The group set out into the night, moving quickly and quietly through the fields, away from the farmhouse and into the dark woods beyond. The wind picked up as they walked, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something colder. Claire tried to focus, to keep her mind sharp. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the creak of branches in the wind. It all seemed too loud, too close. She found herself listening for the sound of distant patrols, the whisper of footsteps in the distance that could signal disaster. The hours dragged on, each step taking them deeper into the countryside, further from the relative safety of the farmhouse. They crossed fields and forests, moving in the shadows, relying on their knowledge of the terrain to keep them hidden. Claire led the way, her eyes darting back and forth, constantly scanning for any sign of trouble. By the time they reached the quarry, it was nearly dawn. The first light of morning was beginning to break over the horizon, but the quarry was still dark and quiet, an eerie silence hanging in the air. Claire's heart raced as they approached the narrow path that led into the rocky gorge. The lookout was supposed to be here, but there was no sign of him, no sign of anyone, just the empty, yawning darkness of the quarry ahead. Her gut twisted with unease. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. But before she could react, the sound of a truck engine broke the silence, distant at first, but growing louder. The convoy was too close. They were running out of time. Without a word, Claire turned and signaled for the group to follow her. They had to move, and fast. There was no going back now. August 15th, 1944. The outskirts of Paris. The streets of Paris had shifted, subtly, over the past few weeks. The tension in the air was palpable, a constant hum of anticipation and fear. The Allied forces were drawing closer, the sound of gunfire from the front lines louder every day, the shadow of liberation inching closer to the occupied city. Yet, for Claire, there was no sense of triumph in the air. She walked through the city streets like a ghost, invisible to the world around her, her Red Cross uniform still the same, though it no longer afforded her the same measure of protection. It had been months since she had carried the last map into the countryside, since she had made that final dangerous trip through the quarry. They had made it barely. The convoy had reached its destination, the intel delivered to the right hands, and the resistance was one step closer to striking a decisive blow against the occupying forces. But for Claire, the victory had been hollow. The war was still ongoing, and her role in it had never been recognized. She had done her part, but the world had moved on, and so had the men and women who had once trusted her. As the days passed, the weight of her isolation became unbearable. She had witnessed so much, so many faces, so many stories lost to history. Resistance fighters who had never returned, their names erased by time, their sacrifices forgotten. The people who had given everything for the cause were mere footnotes in the grand story of war. And Claire had become one of them, another unremarkable face in a sea of silent heroes. She passed by the old grocery store where Georges had once worked, the place where she had received her orders, where she had met countless others who had come and gone in the shadows of the war. The store was empty now, its windows boarded up, the walls cracked and worn. The resistance had scattered, their network broken apart by the sweeping tide of victory. The Allies were coming, but for Claire, there would be no parade, no recognition. There would be no medals for her quiet defiance, no speeches about the lives she had saved, the danger she had faced. There would only be the remnants of a war that had changed everything and left her behind. In the distance, she saw the familiar figure of Pierre, his face lined with exhaustion, his eyes dull from the weight of too many years spent in the shadows. He had survived, just as she had, but what did survival mean when the cost was so high? "Claire," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're coming." She knew who he meant. The soldiers, the officials who had made the decisions from behind their desks. The ones who would show up when the war was over, the ones who would celebrate the victory, but would not remember those who had fought to make it possible. They would remember the generals, the leaders, the ones who had commanded from the front. But they would not remember the people who had bled in the streets, the ones who had smuggled supplies, the ones who had carried maps, the ones who had risked everything for the cause. They would be forgotten. "You're still here," Claire said softly, more to herself than to Pierre. He nodded. Someone has to be. But the truth was, neither of them knew how much longer they could remain. The war was over, the enemy was on the run, but they were still living in the wreckage, trying to pick up the pieces of lives that had been shattered by years of conflict. There was no future for them here, no place for their stories in the new world that was rising from the ashes of the old. They had fought for a cause that no one would remember, and they would be left behind to disappear into history. "I thought I'd be different," Claire said quietly, her voice breaking slightly. "I thought when the war ended, they would recognize us. They would see what we did. But nothing's changed." Pierre shook his head. "You know, it doesn't work like that. They'll remember the victories, the big battles. They'll forget about us. They always do." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some sign of hope, some reassurance that it had all been worth it. But there was none. The war had been a bitter, unrelenting force, and it had left them all scarred. The world would move on, and they would remain invisible. As she walked through the streets, the memories of those months in the resistance washed over her. The faces of the fighters she had met, the ones who had given their lives for the cause, their stories swallowed by time. The maps, the messages, the endless nights spent in hiding. She had carried so many secrets, but none of them would be remembered. No one would write books about the couriers, the ones who had kept the resistance alive in the darkest hours. No one would tell their stories.